I am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 7, Sunday, July 14th, 2024. The lesson is entitled Esther's Bold Faith. Lesson text comes from Esther chapter 3, verses 2 through 3, verses 5 through 6a, and chapter 4, verses 7 through 16. Related scriptures are Esther 1, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 1, and chapter 3, verses 7 through chapter 4, verse 6. Genesis 12, 1 through 3, Daniel 3, 14, 28. The place is Shushan. The time is between 474 and 478 BC. Christianity is often looked at as a religion for weaklings by those who know nothing about it. The Bible, however, is full of examples of courageous people who stood up for what they believed, even to the point of death. In this week's lesson, we explore the need for courageous Christians. Today's aim, facts, to show that Esther was prepared to die, if need be, to save the Jews from destruction. Principle, to teach that Christians must be prepared to live for God, even at the cost of extreme consequences. Application, to urge students to boldly and consistently choose God's way rather than the way of the world. Illustrating the lesson. Christian courage is seen in a willingness to listen to God in spite of danger and to disregard the voice of man. Practical points. 1. We are subject to authorities, Romans 12, 1 through 7. But we need not slavishly grovel before human pride, Esther 3, 2 through 3. 2. When we take a stand on principle, it may affect many others for good or ill, verses 5 through 6. 3. When we seek action by someone in a position of influence, it is wise to have our facts and information documented. 4, 7 through 9. 4. Even for someone in a position of great favor and influence, it can be risky to step out on behalf of others, verses 10 through 12. 5. Seeking the less dangerous course of action often provides no safety. God sometimes put us in the place of risk, verses 13 through 14. Supported by prayer, we can always do the right thing if we are willing to deny ourselves. Esther 4, 15 through 16, Luke 9, 23 through 24. Golden text. So will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Esther 4, 16. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is an evil plan, Esther 3, 2 through 3, 5 through 6a. 2, a dangerous plan, Esther 4, 7 through 12. 3, a godly plan, Esther 4, 13 through 16. Introduction. The book of Esther recounts an incident in Persia that nearly resulted in the annihilation of the Jews. Historically, it fits in the same time period as the book of Ezra. One group of exiles had returned from captivity and the temple had been rebuilt. The events of the book of Esther are set among the Jewish exiles who had not returned but had instead remained in Persia. In this context, God used Esther and her high governmental position to accomplish an unlikely deliverance for his people from their enemies. What makes God's sovereign protection and preservation of Israel even more impressive is that the Israelites in Persia were outside their homeland and thus were not able to worship according to the Mosaic law. Those who had returned to Judea had reestablished worship in the temple. Those who remained in exile had no temple in which to carry out their system of worship with its ceremonies and animal sacrifices. An evil plan. Esther 3, 2. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bow and reverence Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did he reverence. Verse 3. Then the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment? Verse 5. And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. Verse 6. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Mordecai's resistance. Esther 3, 2 through 3. After King Ahasuerus disposed Queen Vashti, he conducted an extensive search for a new queen. Since the Jewish girl Esther fits the parameters of the command for young women to appear before the king, she found herself in a most unexpected situation. The one thing her cousin Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, commanded her was that she not reveal her Jewish nationality. 2:20. Many have noted that the book of Esther is not only an accurate historical account, but also great literature. Short stories normally include main characters, some kind of conflict, an antagonistic, a hero or heroine, a tension that builds to a climax and a resolution. All the elements of such literature are obviously presented here. The antagonistic Haman is first mentioned in 3:1, where we are told that the king elevated him to a position of prime minister in his government above even his 7 counselors, 1:14. Along with the promotion came a command from the king that everyone pay homage to Haman. As a result, all the king's servants sitting in the gates of the palace bowed whenever he approached. The fact that Mordecai was present there might indicate he held a judicial position of some kind. He, however, refused to bow or pay homage to Haman. It was customary, even in Israel, for lower-level people to show the courtesy of bowing to higher-level officials. It is not clear exactly why Mordecai had objections to doing so in this case. The king's servants noticed Mordecai's behavior and asked him repeatedly why he was not obeying the king's command. Mordecai told them he was a Jew, 3:4, and apparently that was the reason he gave for his refusal to bow to Haman. He might have viewed it as disloyalty to God to bow to a foreign dignitary. The servants finally reported him to Haman to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand. Perhaps they wondered if an exception had been determined for the Jewish people. Haman's wrath, Esther 3, 5 through 6a. The most arrogant people are often those who must measure their self-worth by the power or influence they think they have over others. Haman was an extremely arrogant leader. He recognized the king as his superior, but could not accept anyone as an equal. When one man, Mordecai, refused to bow in submission to him, Haman wanted to destroy him. He became consumed with hatred for Mordecai. Haman's hatred soon extended to all Mordecai's people, the Jews. Since God is the one who ultimately controls the hearts of kings, Proverbs 21:1, we recognize that Haman was elevated to his position not just by King Ahasuerus, but by God himself. The Jews constantly lived with the potential for disaster, and they needed protection. God had already had Esther in place for her role, and now he had allowed Haman to attain his position. Although Haman thought he was plotting and carrying out his own plans, God was actually doing a most amazing thing, something that would again prove his faithfulness and sovereign protection of his people. After the king's servants told Haman about Mordecai's attitudes and actions, Haman no doubt paid special attention to Mordecai from then on. As he personally observed Mordecai's refusal to bow before him, his anger grew into wrath. The word for wrath, verse 5, refers to forceful, vindicated anger that is ready to boil over. Haman was not just angry, but also determined that he would get revenge in some way. That in itself was bad, but Haman decided on something extreme. Haman's desire for revenge became more onerous when we read that he scorned the thought of merely laying hands on Mordecai alone, verse 6. His hatred had grown into a haughty disdain for all Jews, and he determined that Mordecai's punishment would have far reaching consequences for all the Jewish people in the empire. Anti-Semitism is not anew. It has been in the world for many centuries. Since God chose the Jews, Satan has a deep hatred for them. He has been the moving force behind the centuries of hatred of Jews and attempts to exterminate them. A dangerous plan. Esther 4:7. And Mordecai told him of all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Verse 8. Also, he gave him a copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him, and to make requests before him for her people. Verse 9. And Hatak came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Verse 10. And again Esther spake unto Hatak, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. Verse 11. And all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. Verse 12. And they told Mordecai Esther's words. Mordecai's report. Esther 4:7-9. Haman knew that if he worked through the king, he would have a much better opportunity to accomplish what he wanted to do, namely annihilate the Jews. He therefore told the king that a certain group of people in his kingdom refused to obey his laws and that they were not worthy of being left alive. He added that he himself would pay 10,000 talents of silver to those who carried out the killing. Without researching the matter further, the king allowed Haman to draw up the decree to have it done. 3:8-15. Before long, Mordecai learned what was happening and went into deep mourning for one. In every province of the kingdom, Jews were mourning, knowing their deaths had been decreed. Verse 3. Esther was told about her cousin's mourning by her servants, and she became deeply distressed. Verse 4. She sent Hatak, a trusted royal servant, to learn what was troubling Mordecai. Mordecai told Hatak all that had taken place, including all what Haman intended to do and the amount of money being paid. Verse 7. Mordecai then gave the servant a written copy of the decree and told him to show it to Esther. Verse 8. But now Mordecai knew what would have to be done. Esther would have to go to appeal to the king for help. Along with the copy of the decree, he gave a command to Esther to go in to the king and plead on behalf of her people. They needed him to rescue them from the certain deaths they all faced. We remember that Esther had obediently kept her nationality secret because Mordecai had instructed her to. This, however, was going to be a much more difficult order to follow. As the queen of the land, she certainly could have disobeyed Mordecai, and he would have been helpless to do anything about it. Her moral convictions, though, made her realize that under God, she still owed him respect as her adoptive parent. We can only imagine the emotional turmoil she went through when Hatak returned with his message. Esther's response, Esther 4:10 through 12. Esther now gave a command for Hatak to give Mordecai an explanation just as serious as the one Mordecai had sent her. It reveals the fact that no one, including her, was allowed to enter into the presence of the king without having been summoned by him. For her to do as Mordecai had commanded would require that she put her life at risk. The only possible reprieve was if the king held the golden scepter out toward her after the appearance. Esther informed Mordecai that she had not been called into the king's presence for a month. She had no idea what his attitude toward her might be. For all she knew, she was not currently being thought of favorably for some reason. This is what made Mordecai's plan so dangerous. If, for any reason, the king resented Esther's coming to him without an appointment, she would be taken out and killed. It really did not matter that she was the queen. This was no doubt a security precaution on the part of Ahasuerus, not something practiced only because of certain whims. There are many historical records of kings being murdered within their palaces or throne rooms. Then the holding out of the golden scepter amounted to an immediate pardon from the king, thus sparing the life of the intruder. Esther was not telling Mordecai anything he did not already know. The beginning of her response, in fact, was, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know," verse 11. Ahasuerus ruled over 127 provinces, reaching east to India and west to Ethiopia 1:1. He was a very powerful king with a multitude of subjects, and it was evidently common knowledge that no one did not displease him. No one dared displease him. Esther was doing her best to cause Mordecai to realize what he was commanding her to do. A godly plan, verse 13. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews." Verse 14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Verse 15. Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai's challenge, Esther 4:13 through 14. Esther may have been the queen and shared many of the privileges of royalty with the king, but she was just as much in need of God's protection as all the other Jews. This is what Mordecai reminded her in the message he sent back to her. If the killing of the Jews got started, sooner or later it would be discovered that she was one of them. Then those otherwise loyal to her would turn against her. Mordecai had faith to believe God was going to protect his children in some way. That is, that the Jews would not be completely wiped out. That did not mean, though, that many individuals would not die. Mordecai felt quite certain that both he and Esther would be among those killed if the decree was not somehow nullified. He very forcibly told Esther this. If she refused to be part of the solution for their salvation, God would accomplish it in some other way. Mordecai then issued the greatest challenge of all. Maybe the very reason she was the queen of the land was for this time of need faced by her people, verse 14. She had direct access to the king, which was not true of any other Jew. She had previously won the king's confidence and love, which no other Jew had done. She was a model of integrity, and Ahasuerus could not have helped noticing. She was respected by him above many others in the kingdom. She was the most logical one to approach the king and appeal on behalf of the Jews. Mordecai was saying that Esther's advancement to royal position was the providence of God at work. She was there according to his will. While we do not see much about Mordecai's spirituality, we do see evidence that he believed in God and the covenants he had established with his people. Mordecai knew God was not going to allow them to be annihilated, for then the covenants would be broken. He was confident that God would rescue his people. Esther's determination, Esther 4:15 through 16. Once again, the courier took a message back to Mordecai. Esther understood the situation completely and was willing to do whatever she could to help, even if it meant her death. If I perish, I perish, she said. One of the things that has puzzled Bible scholars is that the book of Esther never explicitly mentions God or prayer. We recognize that Mordecai's faith in God and his covenants, but we wish as we read the text that there was a clear indication of the personal relationship with God. Now that Esther was faced with the biggest challenge of her life, it would be encouraging to hear her proclaim a deep, settled faith in the Lord. Instead, it is unclear whether Esther's statement is one of trust in God's sovereignty or one of mere fatalism. Perhaps the biblical writer intentionally leaves this ambiguity to make readers decide for themselves whether God is at work in such desperate situations. Even though we do not see Esther's relationship with God spelled out, that should not keep us from recognizing God's providence in the situation or from realizing how important such an intimate relationship with God is in times of trial. Esther's instructions were that Mordecai gather all the Jews in Shushan together and fast for her for 3 days. She and her maids would be doing the same thing at the same time. After the time of fasting and probably prayer, she would go in to the king, even though it was against the law. They were about to see whether or not Mordecai's God would use her as he anticipated. She needed to be as ready as possible. Questions. 1. How is Esther both a historical account and great literature? 2. How do we see God's providence at work in the promotion of Haman? 3. What was Haman's response to the report about Mordecai's actions? 4. How did Haman plan to get back at Mordecai for his refusal to bow and do homage to him? 5. What initial exchange took place between Mordecai and Esther after Haman's decree had gone out? 6. What did Esther remind Mordecai about after hearing his plan? 7. Why was Esther so uncertain how the king would receive her? 8. What did Mordecai suggest was the purpose of Esther's royal position? 9. Why was Mordecai so certain that God would not allow the Jews to be annihilated? 10. What did Esther plan to do? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, July 14, 2024. Thank you for listening. God bless.